Hello, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for this session at the African Investigative Journalism Conference on investigating environmental crimes. My name is Andiswa Matikinca, and today we are talking to journalists who collaborated in one of our recent projects focusing on wildlife crime, a multi-billion-dollar transnational illicit business that is decimating Africa's iconic animal populations and undermining the economic prosperity and sustainable development of countries and communities throughout Southern Africa. This project includes pioneering data-driven tools that share and track court cases related to wildlife crimes. Oxpeckers provides professional support and training for journalists that is focused on ways to combine traditional investigative reporting techniques with forensic data analysis and geomapping. Oxpeckers Investigative Environmental Journalism is Africa's first journalistic investigation unit focusing on environmental issues. It is a nonprofit company that works to improve the quality and impact of African environmental journalism. It provides a home for investigative and data journalists interested in environmental issues and shares resources as well as specialist tools and skills for a range of environmental reporting and research projects. Accessing wildlife crime-related data in Southern Africa remains challenging for a number of reasons. Sometimes this is due to attempted cover-ups, and often it's because the data is stored in hard-to-access PDFs, it isn't digitized, or it overwhelms the capacity of organizations that are tasked with collating or sharing it. Today, we're talking to 4 investigative journalists from across the Southern Africa region who will discuss their latest investigations for Oxpeckers and their experiences of using data in reporting on wildlife crime. The investigations were supported by WITS Journalism and the African Investigative Journalism Conference. The stories that they will be talking about today are part of a series of cross-border investigations into how justice systems in Southern Africa are dealing with rhino poaching crimes. The data collated and analyzed for the stories is shared and updated on a geo-tracking digital tool called Rhino Court Cases. You can find this on oxpeckers.org. They will discuss how they conducted their investigations and also share tips that they learned from the challenges and successes. So first up on our list of speakers, we have Jacqueline Cochrane, who is a South African journalist with a particular interest in combating wildlife crime. She has worked with Oxpeckers for several years, turning complex issues into innovative and impactful content. So Jackie, before you start sharing your screen with us and going into your presentation, I think we have a very interesting question from the audience, which I think would lead us into today's session in its entirety. How do you define environmental crimes?
Thank you so much, Andiswa, and thank you to everyone who's joining us for the session today. Environmental crimes, I would define firstly as a type of transnational organized crime, or certainly a type of organized crime. Perhaps it's not always transnational, but we need to be thinking more broadly than just animals and just the iconic species when we think about environmental crimes. We have to be thinking about illegal logging. We have to be thinking about abalone. We've got to be thinking about smaller species. We've got to be anticipating trends. We've even got to be thinking about sand mining and other crimes that affect our biodiversity. But then we have to crucially link that back to human security, because what makes people care about these crimes is understanding not only the impacts on biodiversity, but also how those are intricately linked to development goals and to human security. So I would say when we think of environmental crimes, we absolutely have to conceive of them in a holistic way that ties together not just environmental security and impacts on biodiversity, but also on human security and development goals.
Thanks a lot for that, Jackie. You can now proceed with your presentation.
Thank you so much, Andiswa. Let me share my screen. There we go. All right, so as Andiswa mentioned, my name is Jacqueline Cochrane. I feel very humbled to be on this panel today. I'm not an investigative journalism in the classic sense as my co-presenters are, and indeed it's a great privilege for me to be on this panel, and I continue to learn from them and from people like yourselves who are both the present and the future of investigative environmental journalism in Africa. My own background is more in a policy environment. I worked for a long time at the Institute for Security Studies, which focuses on human security, hence my strong emphasis on the tying things back to human security. I worked at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, and I also worked at the USAID Canal project, which focuses on combating wildlife crime across Southern Africa. My investigation into Rhino court cases in South Africa was my own first foray into data journalism. And I hope that by sharing some of my experiences with you today, I can teach you how to avoid some of the pitfalls that I experienced. For some of you, it might be a bit of a data journalism back to basics session, but hopefully it'll be useful, and I look forward to your comments and questions and feedback at the end of the session as well. So before I delve into the data journalism experience, I'd like to talk a little bit to the picture that you're seeing in front of you. This photo was taken in 2019 in the Matikinca National Park in Zambia. This was one of a group of rangers, and I'm not sure if you can see very clearly in the background, there's a white rhino cow and her calf in the shadow there. The man in the forefront is one of a handful of rangers who was tasked with looking after these white rhinos. This was the only white rhino population in the whole of Zambia. These guys look after these rhinos night and day. I had the privilege of escaping from a conference room with my colleague at the time, and you know, escaping the air-conditioned boardrooms and the conversations there, and talking to people like this ranger who literally put their lives on the line to protect, in his case, rhinos. And the challenges that he described, he and his colleagues described to me, were insane. People don't have equipment. They didn't have a sufficient 4x4 vehicle to get around when it was the rainy season. Their walkie-talkies were intercepted by police and other law enforcement officials. They literally put their own lives between themselves and the rhinos and faced sophisticated criminals and other dangerous wild animals. And certainly they didn't receive the job recognition they deserved. People like this ranger like I said, put their lives on the line every single day. If we don't see successful convictions, what they're doing is futile. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of people like who do this every single day. So I vowed to try and do something about it in whichever small way I could. And essentially, for me, the way to do that was to connect the dots between that type of work and what happens in the courtroom. And that's why I wrote there, the real war on poaching happens in the courtroom, but the wheels of justice grind slowly in many rhino-related cases, which was what my investigation had found. Okay, so the reason before I delve into this, the reason I mentioned the story about the ranger is because certainly in my experience, data journalism can be daunting. It can be overwhelming. As I write there, at some point you think you've got too much data, and then at another point you think you've got too little. And if you don't, what helped me tremendously was having something like that to hold on to remind myself what I was trying to say and why I was trying to say it. So that, from a personal perspective, I would say was something that made a big difference to me. So I worked with the Rhino court cases data set provided by Oxpeckers, and which is accessible on the Oxpeckers website. I received a spreadsheet that was initially aggregated according to province, the name of accused, the station of the arrested, date of arrest, bail, court case number, charge and description, prosecutor, defense, and court appearances. I didn't know how I was going to say what I wanted to say and what I hoped the data helped me to say until I really started deep diving into the data and cleaning it up. And I would say that is absolutely crucial. In my case, I didn't have to go and source the data set, but whether you are sourcing your own data or you're given a data set, I feel like the starting point is that deep dive into the data. Do the deep dive and then continue diving and dive even deeper. You have to become absolutely intimately acquainted with the data. And just as an initial challenge, what I would say is absolutely allow for way more time than you think you would need. Even in preparing for this session this afternoon and looking at that spreadsheet, and I saw story ideas coming out at me. I saw stories that I still like to write. So give yourself the time to, it's almost like a geometry problem. We were taught at school, like look at the thing and then let it sit and sort of simmer in the back of your mind for a while. I would say do the same thing with the data. If you're not doing that, you're doing yourself an injustice. So bearing in mind deadlines are reality, give yourself as much time as you need. And also when it comes to your planning, I would say realize very consciously that you need to put on several hats and you need several skill sets to do the story justice. If you don't have those skills yourself, find them, be resourceful, find somebody who can help you make sense of the data, find somebody who can help you with coding if that's appropriate to the data set that you're working with, find somebody who can teach you the Excel stuff that you need to know, or if you don't have someone like that, find the open resources that are available online. If you do that stuff up front, it's going to help you significantly to do your story justice. From the original data set, I then began cleaning it up. I looked for inconsistencies in the naming of provinces. I looked for duplications. I looked for, and then I tried to aggregate it even more to the extent that I could. The most useful field that I could add to that was proximity to the poaching incident. There's an old military quote by a US Marine general that says, amateurs think about tactics and professionals think about logistics. And that's worth bearing in mind for any type of organized crime too. It's not about just how you poach the rhino, it's about how you then move that product. We know from wildlife crime and other types of organized crime that the further the product moves actually from the crime scene, from the source, is how the value gets added as part of that organized crime value chain. So the most useful field that I could add into the data set was analyzing the proximity of the case to the crime scene, really. So what I found was that 32% of the cases related to the intention to poach, 38% related to poaching incidents. So that means that those two categories were directly involved, of people directly involved in an act of poaching that had or had been intended to occur. Now, bearing in mind that I know from research that we are actually intending to find high-level people who are involved in wildlife crime as a type of organized crime. This confirmed to me that, in fact, the majority of cases that ended up in court were targeted at low-level people, people who were either intending to poach or who had poached a rhino horn, or had poached a rhino, sorry. Only 26% of the cases that I found were involved where the horn had already changed hands. So where the horn was being moved to a different location, where it was found in a vehicle, where it was found at the airport, that sort of thing. And actually what we would like to see is the inverse. Incidentally, the 32% of cases that entailed an intention to poach, and that was inferred to me by categories such as where people were charged for trespassing with illegal firearms, typically in Kruger National Park. That incidentally is a really good news story. And I think as journalists, we owe it to the people who work really hard on these complex crimes to also tell the good news stories. I think important as well in regenerating some of the public goodwill out there. Rhino poaching is a classic example of something where there's tremendous public goodwill that exists, but it's being depleted. And we do need to talk about the good news stories too. So, you know, those 32% of cases where it was an intention to poach, those are cases where rhinos hadn't been poached, where poaching didn't happen. And often that's a far harder story to tell. We tend to, I think, particularly in data journalism, think about quantifying what happened. But when it comes to organized crime and wildlife crime and environmental crimes, we also need to think maybe how do we quantify what didn't happen? How do we translate that into the successes and tell that story too?
Right, sorry, Jackie, I'm just going to have to interject there for a second. I think we might be running out of time for your presentation, but I'll quickly jump to a question based on something that you mentioned earlier. So how would you say that you would know as a journalist when you've spent enough time with your data? And when can you also say that you've exhausted one specific data set? So what's the limit of the amount of stories that you can get from one data set?
I don't think there is ever a limit because the data should be seen as both a source and a tool. So as a source, you need to know how to interrogate it. You need to know how to talk its language. To do that, you need analytical skills and coding skills. You need to, and I'm just going to fast forward maybe to my last slide here, where I think there's a sweet spot between the story that you know can be told, the story that your sources can tell, and the story that the data can tell. When you feel that you've hit that sweet spot, in my case, the story I knew that could be told was one that had been informed by my background in the policy environment and from organized crime research. The story that my sources could tell, what made the difference in my particular investigation was that I could focus it on, I could hinge the whole thing off an account that was shared with me by a former state prosecutor, where everything had gone right. The police had obtained confessions from the accused, but the whole thing fell flat in the court because there was no DNA linking them to the firearms and the axe. So with data particularly, I would say we mustn't forget the human element. And if you can find a case among your data set that really brings to life the story that you're trying to tell, and then have the data fill in those details, that is approaching that sweet spot. And then obviously when we're looking at the story that your sources can tell, that is a way of corroborating and validating the findings that the data is showing to you, and the story that you know can be told. I think we need to be really careful with data not to think that correlation means causation. So we can't go, because I think the numbers are telling me this, that is a direct link. We always need to validate that as you would any other source. Does that answer the question, Andiswa? Sorry.
Yes, it does. Thank you so much for your insights, Jackie, and thank you for your wonderful presentation. We're now going to move on to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Oscar Nkala, who is a Zimbabwean freelance journalist who has worked with Oxpeckers since 2017, developing a pioneering dossier of investigative work on wildlife crimes in sub-Saharan Africa. I will be sharing Oscar's presentation, so if you can just bear with me for a minute while I bring it up. All right, Oscar, you can take it away.
Hello, Andiswa, and hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me stand here behind PFP and in front of you to discuss my investigation into rhino poaching crimes in Southern Africa, specifically the countries of Zimbabwe and Botswana. But before I do that, I will speak about myself a little bit, where Andiswa has already said that I joined Oxpeckers in 2017 from a background that includes broadcasting and working for various print and broadcast medias around the world. And since joining Oxpeckers, like she has already said, I have worked with with Fiona and Andiswa, among others, to build a dossier of information around rhino poaching, which has happened in and around Southern Africa mainly. And we have also managed to build a pioneering work, dossier of work on the investigation of the donkey skin trade, which is presently a topic of interest between China and Africa. So on to my investigation now. It is an investigation that was titled The Perfect Rhino Crime. And the Perfect Rhino Crime is a two-state investigation, like I would say a cross-border investigation that touches in Botswana and touches in Zimbabwe. Or I can even put it to say it's a three-state investigation because there's a lead into Mozambique that we also try to follow. The first part is about the investigation I carried out into the arrest and eventual escape of 7 Chinese nationals who were arrested in Zimbabwe in Victoria Falls in December 2019. These guys were found with a total of 20 kgs of rhino horn, and then they were taken through the court processes, which took something like 6 months, leading to them being given bail and reporting conditions that bound them to the vicinity of 40 kilometers of the Victoria Falls city. So during this time, it so happened that they organized with the cops and somebody else who was working with the cops at the time to escape from Zimbabwe. And this they did through the help of a former policeman. In fact, he was still serving at that time, who left the city of Valoi and then went to Victoria Falls to pick up these guys and drove something like 900 kilometers to drop them off at a remote border post with Mozambique. So my investigation specifically looked at how this case ended the way it did, how the police handled the investigation, and also how the courts treated the case when it went their way. So my first finding was that the police did a very good investigation, leading to a court case which could very easily have left the Chinese to a point where they would still be in Zimbabwe now, possibly serving some lengthy jail sentences. But what happened in between there is that the justice system failed the investigation, in that after presentations, several court appearances in which the prosecution and the police argued for a denial of bail, they eventually afforded bail by the High Court of Zimbabwe. And this bail actually led them to get that opportunity to start talking to other people and trying to plot their own escape. So this they did, and then they ended up in Mozambique. And then the second part of my investigation specifically looks at a guy called Dumisani Moyo, who was described by the Zimbabwe Parks Authority as a Southern African kingpin of rhino poaching, meaning this guy had networks operating in more than one country. Basically, his story starts in Botswana in 2012, where he was arrested and found in possession, after being found in possession of a single rhino horn. And then he was taken to court. He appeared once and then was granted bail of 1,000 pula. And during that time, he escaped from Botswana and went back to his homeland, which is Zimbabwe. And during that time, he quickly returned to crime. And at this point in time, it was very difficult to arrest him because he was working with members of the Central Intelligence Organization, which is the state security organization in Zimbabwe. And there were also rumors that he had connections with some politicians. So During this time, he managed to poach in Matopo, commit further rhino crimes, poaching in Matopo's National Park in the south of Bulawayo, in the Save Valley, on the border with Mozambique, and several other areas within Zimbabwe until December 2014, when he was involved in a shootout with the game rangers, leading to the arrest of a CIO agent, an agent of the state security organization who was poaching with him. After this, he escaped into Zambia, where he set up base and allegedly started planning poaching raids into Botswana, Zimbabwe, and other neighboring countries, specifically targeting elephants and rhinos. So the case came to an end in December 2017, when he was arrested on arrival in Zimbabwe and then extradited to Botswana, where he was wanted for escaping lawful custody and also to face justice for his involvement in the poaching of a single rhino in connection with the 2012 incident. So my investigation at this point focused on how Botswana handled the case when it entered their jurisdiction. And in this case, it was found out that during the first appearance, the Directorate of Public Prosecutions in Botswana tried to argue for a lengthy detention of the suspect, but then was not able to secure that because the courts did not agree or did not allow the rhino horn that was produced by the police as evidence for the case to be produced as permissible evidence in court. So in other ways, the rhino horn was there, but then it could not be admissible in court. So the second part was that during the process, the final appearance, he actually came into a situation where his lawyers argued for final acquittal or temporary release because the police officer who was supposed to be giving evidence in the case simply did not appear in court on that day. So these are classical cases where despite the good work that was done by the law enforcement agencies, the courts ended up defeating the cause of justice by not maybe listening, in the case of Zimbabwe, not listening to the arguments that were provided by the police to state that they were still investigating and needed time to do so. So on that account, they did not want those Chinese nationals to be granted bail.
All right, Oscar, I just want us to now move on to the data element of your investigations. With a question here on the data that you found on the subject matter. How do you actually take time to decide what's worth investigating and what's worth sharing in your investigations and what isn't? And also what challenges and limitations have you had when it comes to working with data for these exposés?
In this particular case, hello?
Yes, Oscar?
Okay, in the case of the Victoria Falls, and in any case, I would say in both cases, Zimbabwe and Botswana, the first thing, the problem that I came across was the absence of databases on the trial, in fact, from the arrest to maybe the granting of bail of these suspects. The courts that handled these cases did not simply did not have the data. They had the data, but they could not share it. So there is a problem there with the relationship that exists between the press and the courts, the judiciary in this case, and the police authorities in other cases. So the first problem is that there was absolutely no data to start on. So I had to start with a huge amount of information to dig through. Like Jacqueline said, it's something that you start with a huge amount and then you slowly cut it down to something that you can hold on to. And the second thing about such data is that in the absence of a data set, most of our data faces challenges in that in most cases we are dealing with high cases that include connected people that are able to raise legal cases against you. So it puts a real strain on the journalists to say, okay, fine, with this kind of buffering around information, what do I do? The first thing you do is go beyond yourself. Go beyond the ordinary, go beyond the conventional. In this case, go through sourcing. Go into the judiciary, make up your own sources, people that will be able to find information. Go into the police. Like in the case of the Chinese investigation, I found no information and not much help in the court. So the only thing I had to do was to go around to look for the investigating officer who did the case. And luckily he was so forthcoming that I was able to learn a lot from him about how the whole case was, I mean, the whole escape was pulled out and how the High Court and even the lower courts in Wangepange did the case. So it calls for deeper search that you maybe try to establish sources within those organizations that you think the information you are looking for can be. And you do this by sometimes direct approaches and sometimes indirect approaches. So it means you have to be innovative to make friends with those people, and secondly, to ensure that the data they are giving you is accurate. Because there is also a pitfall in sourcing these things through unofficial channels, because the data that you get is often from people that say, oh, I would like to remain anonymous, I won't want to be quoted. And yet you have a story that is already out there published. And if the data cannot stand the test, you are open for a legal challenge that may, convert what you had as a very good headline into one of the major headaches of a legal case.
All right, thank you so much for those insights, Oscar. I actually have another question linked to your last point, but I think we'll get back to that right at the end when you give your parting shots for advice and some of the challenges and experiences you've had when it comes to these exposés. We are going to now move on to our next speaker, and that will be John Grobler. So John is a seasoned investigative reporter from Namibia. His current work in this field was prompted by the return of rhino poaching in Namibia, which has the single largest population of critically endangered black rhinos in the world. John, I think you'll be sharing your screen from your side, so you can take it away. You're currently muted, so I'm going to ask you to please unmute yourself.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so let me see. Share screen. Yes. Sorry, I don't find the pane for sharing screen. It's here. Andiswa, can't you share the presentation? No, I have it open on my screen, okay. But I don't see.
Would you like me to share your presentation for you?
Yes, please.
Okay, no problem. I'm just going to pull it up and then we can start.
Sorry about that.
The presentation.
Share screen.
Okay, so your presentation is up and it should be in full screen mode just now.
Okay, so before one is loading, let me just say this presentation was written with a view of introducing reporters, young reporters, into the world of environmental crime reporting by, inter alia, using data. So it's a more how-to guide than a presentation to knowledgeable experts. So, please bear with me if I seem to be talking down below. Can you go to the next slide, please? So it's very important that, when you are looking at this whole arena of environmental crime, shared from poaching, subsistence poaching, that always has an organized element and almost always a transnational element. Your basic toolkit is still your basic reporting skills. If you are trained to take a bunch of complex facts and force the essential elements of who, what, where, the 5 W's of journalism into the lead, just that will teach you how to find, look for stories, look for the development, look for the new part that makes the news, but in your reporting. it's very important that you have experience in this. There is no substitute for that, unfortunately, because you need to cultivate that source over years and build up a knowledge base. You also have to have an understanding of all the applicable laws that you are dealing with, as well as the international conventions and legal systems that we are looking for. The idea of the bigger picture is, spotting the bigger trends, international trends, to find your local story. How does what is happening in Hong Kong or in China in terms of legislation changes affect your story? Where does it produce a story for you in terms of what you are looking at? It is a difficult field because there is the difference between preservation conservation and utilization conservation. There are people who would like to ban all rhino, trade in rhino, for example, versus those who are on the pro-hunting side and would like to use rhino as an economic resource. There's also the larger background of climate change, climate refugees. We're seeing, for example, an overlap between charcoal burning here and poaching here. And then, of course, there is the role of the Chinese market in all of this. And one of the most important things I discovered in this was a thing called Fei Chan, Chinese flying money, which is basically a paperless, trade-based financial settlement system, whereby it's very difficult to find any connections between the local Chinese kingpin and the Chinese mules he brought in to take the horns for him back to China. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. Okay, so just in terms of Namibia, I only look at Namibia now. There is a very useful resource at the Legal Assistance Center. They basically list all the laws and gazettes and ordinances on their website, which can be filtered by topic and can also be filtered by dates. Then, of course, there are the various international conventions that you need to know about in terms of the transnational element in organized crime, and those you'll find there. There's the CITES definition of organized crime, organized environmental crime. There is there is the IUCN.org resources page that shows you everything you need to know in terms of resources on their side. There's also the various definitions of organized crime and various statutes that apply on the United Nations Organized Crime and Drugs, it's at the UNODC website. The red list, of course, is very important to know what that is and what is on that, because trade in contraband, wildlife contraband, are usually animals that are on that red list. So it's also very, very useful to keep an eye on the traffic reports. They do not so much as prosecute crime, as just report what organized and legal trade there is in terms of wildlife crime, of wildlife, as well as the illegal crime. They're based in Hong Kong, so they're sitting right at the node of this whole thing. Then there is a very important resource in Namibia in terms of what I was doing. There is the e-justice portal, where you can basically go and search for all cases online. But there are caveats to that. I'll get back to those. Of course, there is also very useful websites as Oxpeckers. If you want to know more about what I've been doing for the past 7 years, since 2014, you can go to the Oxpeckers site and search for Namibia poaching links. It will basically give you most of the stories, I think. There's also a very useful thing on the Regulator website that defines what is wildlife trafficking in very specific instances. So a very useful guide for when starting out. Next slide, please. So, I'm not done yet, sorry. Can we go to the third slide? Back one more, please. One more back. One more back. Okay, no, it's one more back, please.
Okay, I think this is the correct slide.
Okay, all right. So, you have to also, of course, yeah, that's the one I was looking for. Yeah, all right. So you need to study your battlefield, basically. I mean, you need to understand how the various parts of Appendix 1, 2, and 3 apply to what you are looking at. You need to see what the level of adherence is to specific countries we're looking at in terms of the CITES laws. Here in Namibia, they're bending them as much as possible. And you also understand that, one country's crime, for example, approaching with abalone here is another country's cultures, as, for example, the abalone trade. There's a very useful reference here that I put up that people can go and look at. You also have to understand the difference between what is just poaching and what is actual wildlife crime. Poaching is localized, opportunistic, poverty-driven at subsistence level, whereas smuggling is a syndicated, profit-driven business that takes advantage of poverty at rural subsistence level to profit from by exporting this stuff. So there are different roles at different levels in this setup. The UN basically identifies 3 levels, namely the harvesters, the intermediaries, and the consumers. Organized, the police, law enforcement have 5 levels, but it will too complicated for me to go into that now. You can look at the.
I'm sorry, John. I think we're having some sound issues from your side, so maybe if you could try speaking very closer into the mic, and maybe try not to move a lot as you're speaking. Also, we might be running out of time, so I'd like you to maybe take 2 minutes to wrap up the presentation, and then we'll take one question.
Yeah, skip on to the next one. Let me just see if I can. I think some of this I've basically covered. Next slide. Okay. Let me just quickly talk about this. All right. Let me just fix on the data. So what I was doing here is I've been reporting on this for some years already, and I built up like an intelligence network amongst various people that I was sometimes paying to give information, prosecutors, law enforcement people, and building up a database of known poachers and intermediaries. So I had like spreadsheets of various names that I was trying to keep track of. It's very difficult because some of these, most of the courts that I'm covering are 1,000 kilometers or more away from Windhoek. Yeah? A few happen in Windhoek, but then the others are up in Puvo, Tapi, Malilo, 2 days drive long. However, there is a useful resource that we get a weekly crime report from the Ministry of Environmental Tourism that gives us a specific crime docket number, crime report number, and you can use that number to basically track cases on the e-justice portal. With limitations. Please, next slide. Next slide. Okay, so what I've been doing is here, there were lots of cases missing, cases that were reported and withdrawn because they weren't ready to prosecute the guy at that point. There is, of course, there's very clear lack of a paper trail in respect of the Chinese that makes it very, very difficult. So yeah, I could write about many things because what I was looking for is I was looking for the common connection between all the environmental crime that I was seeing up in the north with what clearly was an Angolan connection. And one case came up that was connected to a former.
Sorry, John. I think most of our audience is struggling to hear you at the moment. So if I could suggest that you maybe connect and speak through earphones, maybe that would help if you have them within your reach.
I don't have earphones. I don't use earphones. I don't know why. Let me just.
Okay, it actually sounds much better now. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to swiftly move to Estacio. And then once he's done and we've taken a few questions for his presentation, I'll get back to you just for you to wrap up and ask you some questions that will help you wrap up the entire presentation. Is that fine?
All right.
Okay, thanks a lot, John. All right, so moving on to our next speaker. So up next, we have Estacio Valoi, who is a Mozambican journalist who works with Oxpeckers as well on transnational investigations that focus on poaching, climate change, timber looting, and wildlife trafficking syndicates. Estacio will not be doing a PowerPoint presentation for us today, but he will be speaking about one of these investigations which were published earlier this year. So while I'm waiting for the presentation to pop up, Estacio, you can maybe give us a brief introduction, as well as maybe an introduction into your story and your investigation.
Yes, hello. Good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. And once again, talking about one of my recent investigation, which is focused on technical rhino crimes. In fact, one thing is be on the ground, and the other issue is to be working on the desk in order to get all the data from outside, which is sometimes a little bit difficult. And in this investigation, one of the main things which pop up was exactly the release of the 83 rhino poachers by South African government, which were jailed, and at the time we justified the release on a COVID issue. I hope my sound's good. Hello? Okay, we'll continue. And as I was saying, one thing is to be on the ground, another thing is to be working from the desk, and I'm using more to be on the ground. And to come with all this data was difficult, but some people can even ask, was too much data, lack of data, and how was the access? At certain point, was too much data, but in the other side was a lack of data. I'm talking more about official data. So one of the techniques or skills I had to use here to acquire this data was being in touch mainly with the sources which have been cultivating. I'm talking mainly about community sources. And I asked them about new cases, if people from the community have been detained or know what they heard about the new story on a rhino poach. And from there, I had to go to the conservation administration. And from there, I had to go to the Mozambican government, the Mozambican MP, the prosecutors. And was more easy to get data from the organizations which are working on administrative issue related to Mozambican Park. When I took the case to the Mozambican prosecutor department in order to acquire information, the information was given later after the investigation was published. And that this wasn't really helpful in order to come with the fact check between the information which I did acquire from the local communities, which of course were not in court, according to them, and that the information which I did acquire from the Mozambican Parks Administration and the government. And the data between, or the data from all these three different levels was completely different. What means that the data which was released by the government is more vague comparing with the data which I did acquire from the Mozambique National Park Administration Department. And that these people work directly with this kind of cases, which end up in court. If we look to the court case, I'll try to share here this screen. Yeah, let me see. And this will be possible for you to share the screen from that side, if possible. But as I was saying, sometimes by working from the desk to compare all the data and until the stage where we come to a conclusion that this is the data which we have or we can publish without undermining ourselves in terms of facing judicial prosecution. We have always to find people who have a knowledge in this kind of case. Mainly some of the lawyers which have been working on this kind of case. Example, I had to find the lawyers for ANAC, which could explain to me a little bit about how and what kind of data I could use. Because I could end up publishing even the data from local communities, even if they know who have been approaching or who was back. Example, from those 83 people which were released by the South African government. But that, as I was saying, could be also a way of undermining the credibility and also undermine myself. And the main other problem which came up during this investigation was exactly the relation between myself as a journalist and the Mozambican prosecutor department. Even if recently they did train and they did establish permanent lawyers, prosecutors, to deal with the Rhino cases. This shows that there's still, as Carlos said, and I do agree with him, that there's still a lack of knowledge for this new MP about all the kind of environmental crime. And some of the cases, those involved end up being illicit. And if you look at all this data, you will realize that the majority of the people who end up in court are people coming from the low level. It's kind of difficult to have a high-ranking people, not all because they end up avoiding appear on court, but also do the process on how these cases or the process is being done from the police station until the courts. Sometimes comes with several errors, and that these end up undermine all the entire process, and that these people are not really taken to court.
Thank you so much for that, Estacio. I'm just going to have to interject. Reading your investigation, I saw that it also touches on some challenges that were brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic. And I just wanted to find out if you had any issues or challenges that were sparked by the pandemic in your reporting, and if you can share those and how you overcame them.
Yes, I did face these challenges. I said at the beginning, one of the things is to be on the ground, dealing direct with community people, sources, and also deal with the staff members working in this environmental organization, because there you can, being on the ground, you are able to get the information directly. While you are working from far, this becomes difficult. Instead of acquiring this information in the same day or during 2 days, you are obliged to wait, sometimes even months. As I was saying, the information in terms of data I did acquire from the Mozambican MP came after the publication, but have been sending letters months before the publication. And in the middle of it, we also had a lot of bureaucracy. So for one side, the COVID issue was kind of obstacle, but also the financial issues in order to be on the ground as we are used to do. Because usual, we go to the ground, then we do the desk work where we come with all the fact check, the contradictors, and so on.
All right, thank you so much for that, Estacio. I think we should maybe go back to John and get some parting shots from his side, and then we'll move on to Oscar, Jackie, and lastly Estacio if we do have a bit of time. So it would be great if we would all keep that at 1 minute each. John, you can go first.
Can you perhaps just share my second last slide, please?
Okay.
What is important here is what I want to, press home here is that, data without context is often meaningless. You have to understand where your story is at, in order to find what you are now. What I do as an environmental reporter is I'm trying to get him to fix stuff. I'm trying to get them to be more effective in law enforcement. And this is the story I went out to basically tell, because it was very clear from the lack of paper trail we're seeing in many courts that the difficulties in of covering a large country and the logistical hassles for the prosecutors and the police, and the straight weaknesses in the whole system, all kind of added up to an overall picture where you could see there is a lack of political will. You could fix all of this you could fix by having one specialized environmental crime court. And I could write about the links between Ho Chi Minh guy, the Chinese guy I've been investigating, and certain politicians and the Vietnamese buyer. But in the end, I decided, it's better to try and do a positive story than what's going on. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can still hear you clearly. Hello?
Hello, yes, I'm here. Trying to sit as close as possible. I think the problem is actually in your side, but anyway, so I was trying to tell a bigger picture here of a lack of political will, and that was fatally undermining conservation efforts. I could not get any of the officials to say this on the record. Everybody was saying it off the record, but I hope to try and show it by basically showing the gap in the system here. It can be fixed by a single specialized environmental court, but it's not happening. And that is basically, how I use the data in this respect to try and tell a story that I think is actually more important than going after individual, smugglers or whatever. Because it's time we start seeing the overall pattern here of organized criminality between all of these old countries, countries that were all part of the old former national liberation movements. Oscar is seeing in Botswana, and what we're seeing in South Africa, and what we're seeing in Mozambique is also being reflected in how administration is being administered in Namibia. It's more of an obstruction than an assistance. And that is perhaps the biggest story here that is still to be told.
All right. Thank you so much for that, John. John, we'll now move on to Jackie.
Thank you so much, Andiswa. I would just say from a closing point of view, it's useful to kind of vary your vision throughout the process. So zooming in and zooming out. By zooming out, I mean always keep in mind the broader process of how you approach the data in terms of the searching, the cleaning, the analyzing, and then ideally the visualization. If you can have those 4 steps clearly in your head, it'll help you with whatever investigation you're doing. And at the same time, also try and keep that broader picture in terms of the contents, the story that you're telling. Try and, as much as you zoom into the smaller stuff and the details, I would say try and understand the broader organized crime value chain, so that perspective guides you in your story writing. Otherwise, it can easily become a minefield. So that would be my closing shot.
Thanks a lot, Jackie. And Oscar?
In closing, I would like to share with everybody here something that we have not really touched on in terms of challenges to the practice of environmental journalism, but in particular investigations in Africa in general. The operating environment in which we operate in most of these countries, there are legal, headlists to the collection of information. In fact, practicing journalism is something more akin to a crime in some countries like Zimbabwe, for example. So it's one of those challenges that every journalist should understand, that we're looking to the context in your country and then see how you can maneuver in the system, not run out of the system, but maneuver within the system to continue practicing journalism. There will always be challenges like, lack of access to databases, which is the problem that we experience in most countries. And then there will also be issues with the official DOM, where countries simply decide as a matter of policy that they will not be sharing information. I'm talking in this particular case about Botswana, which decided in October 2019 that it would not be sharing anything, any data or incidents relating to rhino poaching and rhino fatalities. And yet rhino poaching in Botswana is at its worst now. I was talking to somebody last week and they were telling me that there's something like 20 rhinos left. But then in the absence of information coming from the state, you can get that information, but you still have the challenge of trying to balance it up with official DOM, which if you don't, you will end up facing legal cases, legal challenges to your story. But at the end of the day, this is the environment we are operating in, and it is the duty of every investigative journalist to pick up from where we are and continue practicing the journalism that we love despite all the challenges that we have.
Thank you so much for that, Oscar. And Estacio?
Okay. What I could say is a good pitch leads to a good investigation. So we always have to know exactly what we're looking for.
Great. Thanks a lot for those excellent closing words, Estacio. Thank you to everyone for joining us today in today's session. I believe a recording of this live session will be available on the AIJC YouTube channel. And enjoy the rest of your evening or afternoon.